The smell of stale coffee couldn't mask the copper stench of a mass casualty. They told Sydney to stay in the supply tent. Her crushed leg made her a liability. Then the heavy rotors rattled the dirt, and a blood-soaked Marine roared over the comms. "Where the hell is Angel 6?" Sydney's left boot dragged, a heavy, dead scrape against the warped plywood floor. It always caught on the seam near the sterile gauze bins. Every time it did, a sharp, white-hot spike drove up through her tibia, settling deep in the marrow of her knee. She didn't wince anymore. Wincing took energy. She just grunted, shifted her weight to a good right leg, and shoved a box of expired combat tourniquets onto the bottom shelf. The forward operating base medical tent smelled like a mix of industrial bleach, melting plastic from the overheated diesel generators outside, and the faint, ever-present odor of unwashed bodies. It wasn't a hospital. It was a glorified canvas slaughterhouse with better lighting. "Sydney, count on the O negative." The voice belonged to Major Hayes. He didn't look up from his clipboard. He never looked up. He was a man held together by caffeine pills, protocol, and a desperate need to not make eye contact with the dying. 16 units, Sydney said. Her voice was flat, raspy from the desert dust that coated the back of everyone's throat here. "And we're down to our last box of fentanyl lollipops. The new kids keep handing them out for sprained ankles. Just tally it," Hayes muttered, scratching something onto the paper. He paused, the pen hovering. "Command just radioed. We have a massive incoming. IED hit a convoy en route Tampa, followed by a complex ambush. It's going to be bad." Sydney instinctively reached for a pair of purple nitrile gloves hanging from her scrubs. Her heart kicked up, a familiar, sick thrill of adrenaline. "How many?" "Too many." Hayes finally looked at her. His eyes dropped to her left leg, encased in a rigid, carbon fiber brace under her loose scrub pants. The look wasn't pity. Pity Sydney could handle. It was calculation. He was doing the math of space and time. "Sydney, I need you to stay back here. Prep the overflow kits. Run the blood runners." Sydney's fingers tightened on the gloves. "I can run a trauma bay, Major. I did it for 4 years before the roof collapsed in Helmand. Yes, I read your file." Hayes cut her off, his voice dropping into that soothing, patronizing tone that made Sydney's jaw clench. "You're too slow, Sydney. If a bleeder crashes, I need people who can pivot, run to the pharmacy, dive over the gurneys. You trip, you become a patient. I can't afford another patient. Stay in the back." He turned and walked out through the plastic flaps. Sydney stood in the dim, dusty light of the supply closet. She didn't feel heroic indignity. She felt a toxic, bubbling cocktail of shame and profound relief. That was the secret she hated most. Part of her, the tired, broken part that woke up screaming 3 nights a week, was glad she was sidelined. She didn't want to see kids with their legs blown off today. She didn't want to smell burning hair or feel the slick heat of arterial blood soaking through her uniform. Let the young, able-bodied nurses deal with the nightmares. She leaned heavily against the aluminum shelving, the cold metal biting into her shoulder. She closed her eyes and listened to the bass wake up to the horror. Outside, the Maskell siren began to wail. It wasn't a continuous screech, but a broken, mechanical howl that cut through the low hum of the generators. Instantly, the ambient noise shifted. The lazy crunch of boots on gravel turned into frantic, pounding sprints. Shouts echoed across the compound. The heavy clack-clack of weapons being cleared, Sydney started pulling saline bags from the crates. Her hands moved with mechanical precision. Grab, check expiration, stack. Grab, check expiration, stack. She hated the mundane safety of the supply tent. It made her feel like a ghost haunting her own profession. She was a spectator, watching through the thick, foggy plastic windows of the tent as the base prepared for the bleeding. The younger medics, fresh-faced and shaking with terrified excitement, ran past her closet toward the trauma bays. One of them, a kid named Peterson who still had acne on his chin, dropped a roll of medical tape. He scrambled to pick it up, his hands trembling so badly he fumbled it twice. Sydney watched him, feeling a sudden, ugly spike of irritation. "Breathe, you idiot," she thought, but didn't say. She just pointed to the iodine bottles he'd missed. Then the low-frequency vibration started. It didn't come through the air at first. It came through the dirt. The floorboards beneath Sydney's good foot began to hum. Dust drifted down from the canvas ceiling, catching in the fluorescent lights like dirty snow. This wasn't the high-pitched, frantic whine of a medevac Blackhawk. This was heavier, deeper. It pounded at the chest cavity, displacing the air in a rhythmic, violent thudding. Sydney stopped stacking the saline. She frowned, wiping a streak of sweat and grit from her forehead with the back of her wrist. Blackhawk rotors beat the air. These rotors crushed it. CH-53C stallions, she thought. Heavy-lift marine birds, but there wasn't just one. The thumping multiplied, layering over itself until the sound was deafening. The plastic walls of the medical tent whipped violently inward. Shelves rattled. A glass bottle of betadine vibrated off a table and shattered on the floor, the dark brown liquid seeping into the plywood. Sydney limped to the entrance of the supply tent and pushed the heavy flap aside. The sky over the landing zone, usually a blinding, cloudless blue, was choked with a massive, swirling wall of brown dust. Out of the grit, 4 massive grey silhouettes descended. They were huge, ugly beasts, their twin rotors churning up a localized hurricane. They weren't marked with the red crosses of standard medical transport. They were combat birds, bristling with door guns, scarred with fresh bullet pockmarks along their fuselages. They hit the dirt hard. The landing gear groaned. Before the wheels even settled, the rear ramps began to drop. The backblast from the choppers hit the medical tent like a physical blow, tearing one of the canvas awnings entirely off its frame. Sydney squinted against the flying sand, tasting the bitter chalk of pulverized rock on her tongue. Major Hayes and his team of medics were already sprinting toward the LZ, pushing wheeled gurneys that bounced erratically over the rutted dirt. They were yelling, but the roar of the massive engines swallowed their voices whole. As the ramps hit the dust, the Marines spilled out. It wasn't an orderly medical offload. It was a chaotic, desperate surge. These weren't men following protocol. They were men running on the fumes of sheer, violent panic. Their desert camouflage was stained black and wet red. They were dragging their wounded, carrying them over their shoulders, hauling them on improvised litters made of uniform blouses and rifles. Sydney watched a massive gunnery sergeant, his face painted in a gruesome mask of dirt and dried blood, kick a gurney away when one of the young army medics tried to grab the soldier he was carrying. "Don't touch him!" The gunny roared, the sheer volume of his voice piercing through the mechanical thunder. "Get your fucking hands off him!" Major Hayes stepped in, waving his arms frantically. "Stand down, Sergeant! We need to get him into triage!" The gunny shoved Hayes back, a rough, one-handed push that sent the major stumbling. The Marine was holding a younger soldier whose right side was a mangled ruin of Kevlar and meat. The younger man wasn't screaming. He was grey, his eyes rolled back, his breathing wet and shallow. "I said no!" the gunny screamed, his eyes wild, darting around the frantic medical staff. He looked like a cornered animal holding its cub. "Where is she? Where the hell is she?" Hayes recovered his footing, his face flushing with anger. "Are you out of your mind? Let my doctors work!" The other Marines, heavily armed and vibrating with combat adrenaline, formed a ragged semicircle around their wounded. They didn't point their weapons, but their hands gripped the rifles with a tension that made the army medics freeze in their tracks. It was a terrifying standoff in the middle of a swirling dust storm. "We don't want your fucking doctors!" The gunny bellowed, his voice cracking with a desperate edge. He looked at the medical tent, his chest heaving. He keyed the radio on his chest rig, the broadcast echoing out of the chopper's external speakers. "I need Angel 6. Bring me Angel 6 right goddamn now, or nobody touches the captain." In the supply tent, Sydney froze. The iodine bottle she had just picked up slipped through her fingers and bounced on the toe of her boot before rolling away. Angel 6. Nobody called her that. Not anymore. Not for 3 years. It was a dead name, buried under the rubble of a collapsed bunker in Helmand Province. It was the call sign she used when she was the only medical personnel left alive for 3 days, keeping 6 shattered Marines breathing with nothing but zip ties, torn uniforms, and a stubborn refusal to let them die in the dark. Her breath hitched. The air in the tent suddenly felt too thick, smelling overwhelmingly of rust and old copper. Her bad leg throbbed, a phantom memory of the concrete beam that had crushed it. She looked out the plastic window. The gunnery sergeant, she recognized the broad shoulders now, the distinctive jagged scar running down his jawline. It was Barnes. He looked older, hardened into something entirely made of gristle and rage. But it was him. And the man bleeding out in his arms was Captain Miller. Hers was screaming at them now. "There is no Angel 6 here. You are wasting time. He is going to bleed out." "Find her!" Barnes roared back, a terrifying sound that was half threat, half sob. "She's here. Command said she was here. Find the limp." Sydney's stomach plummeted. She felt a cold sweat break out across her neck. She didn't want to go out there. She was a liability. She was the woman who counted expired morphine and dragged her foot. If she went out there, she would have to put her hands into the ruin of a human body again. She would have to feel the heat leaving a man's skin. "You trip. You become a patient," Hayes had said. She looked at her hands. They were trembling. Not the fine, excited tremor of the young medics, but the deep, exhausted shake of someone who knew exactly how heavy the cost was. "Damn it," she whispered. The sound was swallowed by the generators. She pushed off the shelving unit. The first step was agony. Her knee joint popped, grinding bone on bone. She ignored it. She dragged her left leg forward, forcing her right to compensate, throwing her weight into a brutal, uneven, lopsided sprint. She pushed through the plastic flaps of the tent. The blinding sunlight hit her, followed immediately by the suffocating downdraft of the rotors. She coughed, tasting sand and diesel exhaust. "Coming through!" she yelled, but her raspy voice didn't carry. She shoved past young Peterson, who was standing frozen with a roll of gauze in his hand. She hit his shoulder with enough force to spin him around. "Move!" she barked. She limped into the chaos of the landing zone. The dust coated her scrubs instantly. She didn't look at Major Hayes. She didn't look at the standoff. She kept her eyes locked on Barnes and the grey, bleeding mass in his arms. "Barnes!" she screamed, her voice tearing her throat. The massive Marine whipped his head around. Through the swirling dirt and the chaos, his wild, bloodshot eyes locked onto her. He saw the uneven gait. He saw the rigid brace under the fabric. The tension drained out of his shoulders so fast he almost dropped to his knees. The other Marines around him turned, their faces slackening with a bizarre, instantaneous relief. "Doc!" Barnes choked out. He didn't call her Angel 6 to her face. It was too sacred for that. Major Hayes stared at Sydney, utterly bewildered. "Sydney? What are you doing? I told you to stay." "Shut up, Major," Sydney said. She didn't shout it. She didn't need to. The sheer venomous authority in her voice made Hayes snap his mouth shut. She reached Barnes. She didn't check the captain's pulse. She didn't ask for a history. She looked at the blood soaking Barnes's boots, recognized the bright, arterial red of the spray, and jammed her bare, ungloved hand directly into the mangled gap of the captain's right hip. The captain convulsed, a wet gasp escaping his blue lips. Sydney dug deep, her fingers bypassing shattered Kevlar plates and torn muscle, searching blindly in the hot, wet dark. She felt the pulsing, slick tube of the femoral artery. It was severed, retracting up into the pelvis like a dying snake. She pinched it shut against the pelvic bone with her thumb and index finger, squeezing with every ounce of grip strength she possessed. The bleeding instantly slowed from a violent spurting to a sluggish seep. Sydney looked up at Barnes. Her face was splashed with red. The cynicism, the fear, the exhaustion, it was all shoved into a locked box in the back of her brain. Her bad leg screamed at the awkward angle, burning like it was on fire. She didn't care. "Get him on the goddamn gurney, Barnes," Sydney commanded, her voice dropping into a low, terrifying calm that cut right through the noise of the rotors. "And if you drop him, I'll break your other jaw." Barnes let out a wet, breathless laugh. "Yes, ma'am." Sydney turned her head to look at Major Hayes, who was standing completely paralyzed by the sudden shift in power. "Major," Sydney said, her fingers cramping deep inside the captain's flesh. "I need an OR now, and you're going to have to wheel us because I can't let go, and I sure as hell can't walk." The gurney wheels chattered violently against the warped plywood floorboards, transferring every jolt directly up Sydney's stiffened arm. She was practically draped over Captain Miller, her left knee locked out entirely, dragging her deadened foot while Peterson and Major Hayes pushed. Her right hand remained buried to the wrist in the meat of Miller's thigh. The heat radiating from his open wound was entirely at odds with the cold, grey pallor of his face. "Keep it moving, Peterson! Lift the front over the damn threshold!" Hayes barked, his voice cracking. He wasn't patronizing anymore. He sounded like a man who had suddenly stepped off a curb into traffic. They slammed through the double plastic doors of Trauma Bay 1. The shift in the atmosphere was instantaneous. Outside, it was all swirling diesel dust, the deafening chop of the rotors, and the screams of triage. In here, it was a harsh, artificially chilled box of blinding halogen light and the sharp chemical reek of chlorhexidine. It smelled like bleach and copper. "Transfer on 3, Hayes ordered, moving to the head of the bed. 1, 2, 3. Sydney had to shuffle sideways, her bad leg screaming as the lateral movement ground the damaged cartilage in her knee together. She hissed through her teeth, a sharp intake of air that tasted like sweat and iron. But her fingers never loosened. She kept the severed femoral artery pinned hard against Miller's pelvic bone. They slid him onto the stainless steel surgical table. It was freezing cold against Sydney's forearm. "I need suction now!" Hayes shouted, snapping his sterile gloves on. He looked at Sydney, his eyes wide above his surgical mask. "I need you to move your hand so I can get a vascular clamp on that stump." "No," Sydney ground out. Her triceps were beginning to spasm, small, involuntary twitches jumping under her skin. "You can't see a damn thing down here. The cavity is full. If I let go, the stump retracts further into the pelvis, and he bleeds out in 60 seconds. I am the surgeon here, Sydney. Then be a goddamn surgeon and find the other end of the vessel." She snapped. Her voice was guttural, stripped of any professional deference. "You want this clamped? You slide your forceps down my fingers. You use my hand as the guide, but I am not letting go." Hayes stared at her for a fraction of a second. The absolute, unyielding certainty in her eyes broke his hesitation. He grabbed a pair of long silver vascular clamps from the sterile tray. "Peterson, get that suction running!" Hayes yelled. The young medic scrambled, his hands shaking so violently he dropped the plastic tubing twice before jamming it into the machine. The loud, wet, slurping sound of the vacuum filled the room as Peterson plunged the tip into the pooling blood around Sydney's wrist. The Red Sea slowly drained, revealing the shredded yellow fat, the pale white of fascia, and the dark, ruined muscle. "Okay," Hayes said, his breathing shallow. "Guiding down your index finger." Sydney felt the cold, hard steel of the clamp slide against her blood-slicked skin. It pushed deep into the wound, forcing its way past torn tissue. The metal pinched her knuckle, a sharp, biting pain. She didn't flinch, she just kept her grip locked. "I'm at the tip," Hayes murmured, his forehead glistening with a sudden sheet of sweat. "I'm opening the jaws. You need to roll your thumb back on 3. If you slip, we lose him." "I won't slip," she whispered. 1, 2, 3. Sydney rolled her thumb. The thick, rubbery end of the severed artery tried to writhe away. A pressure hose suddenly unkinked. Before the hot spray could even clear the cavity, Hayes clamped down. The metal jaws clicked shut. Sydney pulled her hand out. It came out with a wet, suctioning sound. Her skin was dyed a deep, dark crimson, slick and dripping onto the sterile blue drapes. Her hand remained cramped in a claw-like shape, the muscles temporarily frozen from the exertion. "Got it," Hayes exhaled, his shoulders dropping 2 inches. "I have it. Tie him off. Peterson, get the bovie cautery. We have a dozen smaller bleeders." Sydney stepped back from the table. The moment the immediate, life-or-death physical connection to the patient was severed, her own body registered the damage she had just done to it. Her left leg simply gave out. The carbon fiber brace shrieked, a sharp mechanical crack as the joint folded. Sydney crashed hard against the aluminum supply cabinets behind her, her shoulder slamming into the metal doors. Vials of lidocaine rattled violently on the shelves. She slid halfway down the cabinet before catching herself, her good right leg trembling under the sudden, massive load. "Sydney?" Peterson looked up, his eyes terrified, the suction tube wavering in his hand. "Keep your eyes on the field, Peterson." Sydney rasped, gritting her teeth. The pain in her knee was a living, breathing entity. It felt like someone had driven a hot spike through her kneecap and was slowly twisting it. She pressed the back of her head against the cool metal of the cabinet, staring up at the blinding halogen lights. She closed her eyes. The darkness behind her eyelids wasn't black. It was a swimming, nauseating red. She focused on the mechanical sounds of the room, the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor, the sizzling, popping sound of the cautery pen burning human flesh, the sharp smell of smoke. She was useless now. She knew it. The surge of adrenaline had vanished, leaving behind a cold, hollow shell of a woman who couldn't even stand up straight. She was exactly what Hayes had called her, a liability. She watched Hayes work. He was fast. He was precise. Without the massive arterial bleed blinding him, he moved with the mechanical efficiency of a man who had done this 100 times. He didn't need her. He had never needed her. Barnes had needed her. The Marines outside needed the ghost of Angel 6, the myth of the woman who didn't let people die. But myths didn't have crushed bones. Myths didn't drag their feet. Sydney gripped the edge of the counter with her bloody hand, leaving a perfect crimson handprint on the white laminate. Slowly, agonizingly, she hauled herself upright. Her leg throbbed, a dull, sickening bass note of agony that radiated up into her hip. She limped toward the scrub sink in the corner of the trauma bay. She didn't ask for permission to leave the sterile field. She just turned her back on the table. She kicked the foot pedal for the water. It sputtered, coughing out a blast of air before a stream of tepid, over-chlorinated water splashed into the metal basin. She thrust her hands under the stream. The water turned instantly pink, then a deep, opaque red as it swirled down the drain. She grabbed a coarse scrub brush and jammed it into a brick of iodine soap. She scrubbed her skin. Hard, She scrubbed until the bristles tore at her cuticles, until the skin on her knuckles was raw and burning. She wanted the smell off her. She wanted the sticky, resinous feel of another person's life out from under her fingernails. It wasn't heroic. It was profoundly, deeply gross. She felt sick. The cynical armor she wore every single day. The quiet supply closet nurse who counted expired bandages had cracked wide open, and the raw, unhealed nerve underneath was exposed to the open air. "Heart rate is stabilizing," Hayes announced from the table. His voice was clinical again. "Blood pressure is coming up. 60/40. He's holding." Sydney dropped the scrub brush into the sink. She didn't dry her hands. She just stood there, water dripping from her raw fingers, staring at the swirling pink foam circling the drain. She had kept him alive. But she knew the truth. It wasn't a miracle. It was just plumbing. You plug the hole, you stop the leak. That was all they did here. They were just mechanics working on a perpetually broken assembly line, patching up the meat so it could be shipped back home in a slightly more intact condition. The heavy plastic doors of the trauma bay yielded to a slow, deliberate trudge. It was not the frantic scuff of a medic. It was the exhausted drag of combat boots. Sydney did not turn around. She slowly dried her hands on her scrub pants, leaving damp, dark streaks across the blue fabric. Only when the heavy footsteps stopped did she look over her shoulder. Gunnery Sergeant Barnes stood just inside the threshold. He looked massive and entirely foreign under the harsh, sterile halogen lights. A thick crust of brown dust and dried, flaking blood painted his uniform. His chest rig, heavy with spare magazines and grenades, reeked of cordite, stale sweat, and diesel exhaust. He did not look at Major Hayes. He did not look at the steel table where his captain was currently being stitched back together. Barnes looked only at Sydney. "He is holding," Sydney said. Her voice was utterly flat, stripped of the comforting warmth expected of a nurse. She leaned her hip back against the metal sink, carefully keeping the weight off her left leg. The major got the bleeder clamped. "They are closing the fascia now. He will need a medevac to Landstuhl tonight, or he loses the leg to infection. But he breathes." Barnes exhaled. It was a long, rattling breath that seemed to deflate his massive frame. His rigid combat posture dissolved into sheer, profound exhaustion. He dragged a dirty hand down his face, smearing the dried blood on his cheekbone into a muddy, reddish paste. "Thank you," he said. It was not a polite formality. It sounded like a confession. "Do not thank me," Sydney replied, the words tasting like ash and iron in her dry mouth. "Thank the major. He performed the surgery. I just stood there and acted like a human piece of plumbing." Barnes let his hand drop to his side. He looked at her left leg, staring directly at the rigid brace visible beneath the thin scrub material. He remembered the mortar strike in Helmand. He remembered digging her out of the collapsed bunker, a leg trapped under a sheared steel beam, while she continued to bag a wounded corporal with her one free hand. "You think my boys care who tied the surgical knot?" Barnes asked, his gravelly voice dropping to a low rumble. He took a heavy step closer. The sharp smell of the war rolled off him. They do not care about his medical degree. They care that when the sky falls down, the person standing next to them is not going to run away. "I cannot run, Barnes," Sydney said bitterly. "I can barely walk. That is why they keep me in the supply closet." "You did not run today," Barnes countered. "You dragged yourself out into the dirt. You put your hands back in the blood. You anchored us." He reached into a stained utility pouch on his chest rig. For a second, Sydney braced herself, expecting him to pull out a challenge coin or some other meaningless piece of military sentimentality she would have to forcefully reject. Instead, he pulled out a small, crumpled plastic package, Found these in the captain's assault pack. Barnes murmured. I figured your pharmacy might be running low. I know the new kids hand them out like candy. He placed the package of fentanyl lollipops on the edge of the metal sink. It was a stupid, mundane gesture. It was a purely logistical transaction. But it was exactly what she needed. It was not a medal or applause. It was a quiet acknowledgement of the grim reality they both inhabited. They were just two tired people counting inventory, trying to survive until tomorrow. Sydney stared at the wrinkled wrappers. A tiny, imperfect fracture formed in the hard, cynical shell she had built around herself. A hot, stinging pressure pricked at the corners of her eyes. She refused to blink. Yeah, she whispered, her throat impossibly tight. We were out. Barnes gave a single curt nod. He turned and walked back out. Sydney stood alone, listening to the steady beep of the monitor. She pushed off the sink, stepping heavily on her dead, solid leg. An anchor. If Sydney's raw fight for survival and loyalty hit home, don't leave just yet. This is the reality of the front lines, where heroes aren't perfect, just stubborn enough to never let go. Hit that like button if Barnes and Sydney's story kept your heart racing. Share this video with someone who appreciates gritty, grounded storytelling, and subscribe to the channel right now. We have more intense, deeply human battlefield stories coming your way. Don't miss out.